In this lecture, I'll be going over both culture and personality as well as functionalism. There's quite a bit of information in both of these sections in McGee and Worms, and this is, of course, only a very small fraction of the total information available on both of these schools of thought in anthropological theory. So the outline of the lecture will be as follows. I'll talk about culture and personality rather quickly in relation to some of the work of British anthropologists, particularly looking at some of the history of British anthropology leading up to functionalism, including Pitt Rivers, Court Hayden, and other types of settings, particularly the importance of museums in early British anthropology, and then looking at the school of functionalism with the primary works of Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown. So the culture and personality school in American anthropology, a lot of ways this is a response to some of the work that Franz Boas was doing. And Boas claimed and he insisted on a holistic study of culture, but he really lacked a compelling principle in order to guide this work. Although he used the rhetoric of holism, many of the historical particulars tended to treat culture as a chance association of disparate features. In order to circumvent this problem without challenging the basis of historical particularism, and hence their mentor Franz Boas, Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict, amongst others, looked towards other disciplines such as psychoanalysis and Gestalt psychology to examine personality as interrelated psychological pattern rather than a collection of separate elements. But that both Mead and Benedict were influenced by this, who focused on the psychological concept of personality as their unifying theme. Benedict, Mead, Gardner, and Du Bois examine the problems of how humans acquired culture and culture's relationship to individual personality around three broad themes within the culture and personality school. First, the relationship between culture and human nature. This is exemplified in Margaret Mead's work, Sex and Temperament in Three Primitive Societies in 1935. The relationship between culture and individual personality, Ruth Benedict's work of psychological types in the cultures of the Southwest in 1930, and then the relationship between culture and society's typical personality type, the work of both Gardner and Du Bois. Clara Du Bois, she's primarily known for her work on the modal personality structure, noting that each culture favors the development of a particular type or types of individuals which will be most common within that culture. She does acknowledge intracultural variation within a culture, that is, there is some disparate beliefs and practices within, as well as development within a particular culture. During World War II, like many anthropologists at the time, she was very much involved in U.S. politics, and she worked for the U.S. Government. She worked for the Office of Strategic Services in research and analysis, and eventually as the chief of the Indonesian section. In 1944, she was in Ceylon or Sri Lanka as the head of the Southeast Asia Command there. She's associated with the Women's Health Organization, or World Health Organization. She was also a campaigner for the rights of women, and indeed in her academic career, this was somewhat stalled in part due to the prejudice against women in academia, but she was eventually able to find a university position. She worked with both Alfred Kroeber and Robert Lowy, graduating with her PhD from UC Berkeley in 1932. Eventually, in her career, becomes the first tenured woman in the anthropology department at Harvard. Ruth Fulton Benedict was well versed in the psychoanalytic literature. She came to anthropology through literature, so she was very talented in terms of writing. She wrote a number of pieces. Some of her primary works include Anthropology and the Abnormal, and here we can see references to cultural relativism, as well as patterns of culture. In Anthropology and the Abnormal in 1934, Benedict argues that the normal and the abnormal were culturally determined, and what was normal to one culture might be what was abnormal to one culture might be perfectly acceptable in another culture. Abnormal. In terms of patterns of culture in 1934, she proposed that each culture had a unique pattern called cultural configuration, which determined the fundamental personality characteristics of that particular group of people. Perhaps best known in culture and personality, arguably within American anthropology, is Margaret Mead. She was a frequent and featured writer in a number of lay publications. She heavily influenced U.S. policy along a number of directions, including particularly education. She was active in issues of food as well as the legalization of marijuana within the United States. She was, again, very prevalent in the literature in the 1960s and 70s, and a lot of this was based on her early work regarding sexual mores within U.S. society and the tension that this caused individuals in the transition from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. Her insights of anthropology were deployed into looking at American and Western culture, and she reports about how purportedly healthy attitude towards sex in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia traditional cultures helped to inform the 1960s sexual revolution. So a lot of this work she does earlier, and then it comes out and is utilized in the context of the 1960s sexual revolution. In World War II, like many others during this time period, she was actively involved with the United States. She served as the executive secretary later of the NRC's Committee on Food Habits. She was the curator of ethnology at the American Museum of Natural History from 1946 to 1969. In terms of academic positions, at Columbia University as an adjunct professor starting there in 1954 and then all the way through to 1978. And then at Fordham University, where she helped to found that Department of Anthropology, where she was a full professor of anthropology and the chair of the Division of Social Sciences. Margaret Mead's works are prolific. They're rather accessible to broad audiences. And again, this really comes out in her later work in terms of popular publications as well as media appearances and advocacy perspectives within anthropology. She is perhaps best known for her work coming of age in Samoa, growing up in New Guinea 1930s, sex and temperament in three primitive societies, male and female, and continuities in cultural evolution. There is a debate within anthropology. In 1983, 5 years after Margaret Mead died, Derek Freeman published Margaret Mead in Samoa, The Making and Unmaking of an Anthropological Myth, where he talks very specifically about the informants, about how they had deceived Mead, how they had deliberately led her astray on a number of issues. And so this was also addressed later on by Orens in his book, Not Even Wrong, which critiques the whole Mead-Freeman debate in the context of a scientific anthropology in terms of being able to collect data and facts. Okay, so moving on here, let's talk about British anthropology. One of the early founders of British anthropology was August Henry Lane Fox Pitt Rivers. And you might tell that seemingly this guy has a lot of names here. So he has a fair amount of money as well. He's a rather dapper individual here. He inherited quite a bit in terms of his collections, and really he sort of put this right into the context of the museums that he helped, the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is now in Oxford, and I'll show pictures of that just on the next slide here. He came from a military background as well. He was elected to the Ethnological Society of London in 1861 and the Anthropological Society of London in 1865. Like Hayden, he believed the museum was the foundation upon which anthropology rested. And indeed, for many British anthropologists and British anthropology as a whole, in terms of training, this was the predominant school of thought, that the museum was in fact, or should be, the very center of anthropological research. But he presented his museum as a whole in 1874 as more of a museum for the public, the lay public as a whole, rather than a research tool. And indeed, this is some of the issues that you see with museums today, attempting to balance various missions in terms of educating the public, creating a number of displays, and then of course the selection that goes into play in terms of what objects actually make it a display, how those displays are structured, and then how the rest of the collection is curated. Some of that, of course, being off property or in rather extensive basement type of settings, not really seeing the light of day for most people. However, researchers would then have access to those materials. He organizes displays by subject to convey a message of the gradual nature of human progress. but also to a certain extent he rips these out of the historical context within which these objects find themselves and how they're utilized. Of course, this is a broader critique of museums as a whole. The Pitt Rivers Museum is probably most infamously known for its collection of shrunken heads, as well as a number of collections of artifacts. Many of these, of course, we think about these in the context of the United States, and many of these artifacts coming from the Americas, particularly the United States, would potentially be subject to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and hence repatriation to Native peoples. And of course, this is a big issue in the context of England as a whole, with a long controversy that had existed around the Egyptian remains and artifacts that had been collected by the British during various military encounters. So anthropology in British universities, this was primarily led by Oxford, that had divisions in both physical and social anthropology with an emphasis on material culture or technology. Again, the museum was playing a key part in the formation of most departments, and it was viewed as a necessary adjunct to science. So if you were doing anthropology, early British anthropology, you were doing it in the context of a museum. The functionalists come on the scene when what is predominating within British anthropology is the school of thought of diffusionists. And we've talked about this before, but just to reframe it here, diffusionists essentially argue that social practices tend to develop only once, and that therefore commonalities and differences between societies could be explained by a historical reconstruction of the interaction between societies. This has racist overtones which tied into the ideological arguments of the Nazis as a whole. The functionalists, on the other hand, describe the material, social, physiological, and psychological characteristics of different people. Their main project was attempted to carry out the research agenda implied in Spencer's social organism, in that society, much like an organism, had different organs that compose the organism and determine what each part does, and they wanted to show the way in which each one of these is related to the others and supports the fully functioning organism as a whole. Functionalism has often been referred to, or early British anthropology has often been referred to as the handmaiden of colonialism, and to a certain extent some of these critiques are fair, given the situatedness and a lot of the emphasis of the research, as well as the geographic location and time period of the research. Functionalism was conceived and practiced largely by European anthropologists in territories that were European colonial possessions. The primary focus here was the study of the function of cultural institutions in relation to the maintenance of social order and the smooth working of society. Indeed, early on, Alfred Court Hayden had campaigned very vigorously for an imperial bureau of ethnology. He was turned down for this, but nevertheless, this was the type of argument that was being advanced for the development of anthropology as a whole. In terms of their regards to history, the functionalists depart from Franz Boas in that they were only marginally interested in history. They noted that it did little to clarify the functioning of social institutions as they exist today. Further, from a historical context, it was impossible to accurately reconstruct the history of pre-literate societies, and so restricted their analysis to the structure of current societies. And here, of course, this goes into the entire tension between historical and prehistorical societies and the presence of writing as an element of technology and symbolic information coding, and having this be a primary mechanism of exchange, that certain societies, certain cultural groups exist outside of history and therefore cannot be studied in any meaningful way, which is of course interesting because the functionalists seem to have a fair amount of information that they were deriving from material sources in the context of museums. So this would, for me, this calls into question why they wouldn't just look at some of the historical collections, the archaeological collections, in attempts to determine what might have been happening historically as well. They were interested in direct observation, and so they were looking at the functioning of the current system. This was the primary importance for them. They were concerned with the discovery of scientific laws, again, contra Boas here, that would be valid for all societies. And they saw social systems as inherently logical, rational, as well as they could be explained.